not going to pretend I'm comfortable being videotaped for this. Try not to mug for the camera.
I'm just following directions.
I want to start out by saying how honored I am to be invited to speak to you all. I'm going to start by saying, actually, I've been pretty nervous about coming to speak to you all. This is one of my favorite topics. It's been 15 years. So, a lot of the details, the things that I learned, people that I met, names, faces, a lot of it's getting fuzzy. And, I thought a lot about what could I talk about? What could I come here and share with you all? It's funny, I kind of suspected after 15 years and seeing how active you all have been that, me coming here and sharing the history of Tolomato, I feel like you all know as much about it as I do at this point. So that's not really what I'm here to do today. What I thought it would be nice to do is come in and share my story of my experience of finding this place, the project that I undertook. And to prepare for this, I've been going back through old notes. I've been, remembering the experience of what I learned and just sort of reflecting on it. And I'm really grateful for that opportunity and to also be able to share it with you. So one of my favorite icebreakers is to ask someone about their favorite place. And that could be historic, it doesn't have to be. Whatever the answer is, there's usually a pretty good story tied to it. For me, that place is Tolomato Cemetery. I talk about it whenever I get a chance. But I've always loved old places. I grew up in Gainesville, so I was always pretty close to St. Augustine, and I used to come here all the time. I'd come on field trips, I'd come with my family. When my wife and I started dating, we'd come on the weekend all the time. We got married, we had like a mini honeymoon here, and we would come here all the time for our anniversary to celebrate. So all of that's to say that by the time I went to Cornell, my heartstrings were pretty firmly planted in St. Augustine. So, something to know about my graduate program. Thesis anxiety sets in before the first snow in Ithaca, for first year students. By the time we're halfway through that semester, we're already thinking about what is it we're gonna do? What are we gonna study? We're looking for topics, we're brainstorming. Anytime we're working on a project, we're seeing, is there an angle that we can go after something that'll be really interesting to us and rewarding to us to spend as much time as you spend on a thesis. By the end of my first semester, I already had a number of topics I was considering. And I had a couple in St. Augustine, but Tolomato was the top of that list. And so for the next 2 years, Tolomato Cemetery was my job, it was my hobby. I read books and articles on cemetery preservation. I studied funerary history, art, architecture. I studied material conservation issues. I attended workshops. I went to many, many cemeteries, right, honey? And, I was really interested in seeing how these different places compared to one another. How were they similar? How were they different? What sort of challenges and risks came up towards their ongoing maintenance and preservation? And how were different groups in different places and circumstances dealing with that? How are they addressing it? So I also studied St. Augustine. I studied the history. I wanted to learn how the city evolved. I wanted to learn how the cemetery evolved with it. And it was a great deal of time over those couple of years where essentially I did everything I could. I did coursework relevant to this topic. I stretched the parameters of assignments to make them relevant to this topic. And then I go home and continue to explore it on my own. So during that time, the most common question that I got, and I still get, is why? Well, I've always been interested in cemeteries. For as long as I can remember, I've been visiting old cemeteries. My dad used to take me to them. I often visited Huguenot Cemetery whenever I was in town. Anytime it was open, I'd go wandering in there. I don't think there's ever a time that I went to St. Augustine that I didn't stop and at least like look in at Tolomato, like everybody. You know, I was always interested in it. I think there's something about a place that serves such an important role in people's lives. And in the case of a cemetery, it'll serve that same role for generations. I think that, and I'm not really talking about like burial, I'm talking about remembrance. You know, people go to cemeteries to grieve and remember. They go there to literally like carve out a space in their communities so that they can feel close to someone that they've lost. And I think that that colors a space over time. I think that it creates a different atmosphere. And I've experienced that feeling in cemeteries everywhere that I've been. So I gravitated towards cemeteries. But why Tolomato? I think that's the other big question. And I think it's a fair one because I didn't really have a personal connection to Tolomato before I took on this project. You know, before I went to Cornell, you know, skipping slides. Before I went to Cornell, you know, I knew the cemetery, I was really interested in it, but it's not like, I'm not Catholic. You know, I don't have any ancestors buried in Tolomato. In fact, I'm probably the first Kerr to ever step foot in Tolomato. But I've been by it so many times and never visited it, never been inside, never been any closer than Cordova Street. And I couldn't tell you how many times and how many different stages in my life I stopped at the fence and just looked in. You know, I was always curious about it. But all I knew were the stories of tour guides. You know, we've all heard them. You know, it's a mix of fiction and kind of like near misses with facts. But I wanted to know the real story, and like the rest of the folks lying at Cordova Street, standing at the fence all the time, I wanted in. And so early on, I started researching the history, just to see like what I could learn about it, feeling out the topic, what I could do with it. And it turns out, like just at the high level, getting to know the cemetery, that story is gripping. You know, you've got this Spanish mission to a tribe in Georgia. Over time, that mission's relocated several times until it's in the very shadow of St. Augustine, because the British wouldn't leave alone. Ultimately, they flee St. Augustine with the Spanish in 1763. A little over a decade later, you have a group of refugees that settled in St. Augustine, and they established a cemetery at the site of that mission. And this is that cemetery. You know, I always found it fascinating that whenever these settlers, you know, the city's incredibly important Menorcan ancestors, when they settled there, whenever they were visiting the cemetery, there would have been this tower. There would have been this incredible coquina stone tower with this domed belfry on the top. And it stood there for another 20 years before it was eventually dismantled and the stone reused. And that stone is in the cathedral today, somewhere in the construction of that building in the plaza. To me, that's incredible. Now, as the city became American, you know, new visitors were curious about this cemetery. You know, you already start to see accounts pretty early on of this being referred to as like an ancient burial ground, which is hilarious to me because it was probably a little more than 50 years old at the time. But I think that's because it was different. You know, unlike the cemeteries they found in their communities, it really stood out. It was unusual. It was also known for some pretty prominent figures that were buried there, including church leaders, community leaders. Some of them were characters, like Jorge Biasu, who must have seemed larger than life. You know, one of the famous stories of Tolomato is that of Father Varela and Bishop Barreau, which is fascinating because they essentially competed for the most prominent grave after their deaths, you know? This is a piece of old St. Augustine. You know, it has its roots in some pretty early history, and it stretches all the way to the present. And it's been collecting fascinating stories this entire time. So the more I learned about this place, the more I wanted to learn. So it was pretty clear to me pretty quickly that this was the rabbit hole for me. So that's why Tolomato. There was another question that was often posed to me. This often came through the fence at the cemetery itself while I spent the summer documenting it. And that was, how did I get permission to do this? That's simpler, though it didn't seem it at the time. You know, I asked the right person. You know, I didn't know where to begin. I didn't know who to ask. But I knew the only way that I could do this project is if I could get the access that I needed to really get to know the place. And it was actually Bill Adams who helped me there. I don't know if I need to introduce Bill Adams. You know, he was such a fixture in St. Augustine for so long. He worked in heritage tourism in the city. Bill helped me with a project that I took on my first semester at Cornell. And after that, we just continued to communicate. And I'd usually stop in and see him whenever I was in town. And I started telling him that I was interested in doing a project in Tolomato. And he suggested I reach out to John Garofalo. I want to pause here to note that, like, if I had a hand in any of this, like any of the incredible things that Elizabeth was sharing, like none of it would have been possible were it not for John Garofalo. You know, because I was some 20-something stranger, some kid from upstate New York reaching out to him by email, proposing a student project to inventory his cemetery and develop some sort of like maintenance tools to help them continue to preserve it. And I didn't expect a reply, but he reached out and right away and said he was interested and wanted to meet me in person. So, you know, I arranged to come and see him in person, and we talked and made the arrangements to get the access I needed to move forward with the project. So I've always been very grateful for John. But with that, I had my project. So what I wanted to do was thoroughly document the existing conditions of the cemetery. I wanted to research its history, how the cemetery evolved, and explore different challenges to its preservation and maintenance over time, including issues of access and interpretation. So I spent the summer of 2008 in St. Augustine, and I split my time between an internship at the Castillo and this project. And my goal that summer was to produce a really detailed map of the cemetery, inventory all of the markers, and collect as much research on the cemetery as I could. So I was immediately out of my depth when it came to mapping the cemetery. I had a little experience by this point with measured drawing, but none with mapping. And I bought this handy dandy book that somebody made on how to old school map cemeteries. And you know, I got a quick tutorial from an advisor at Cornell before I left. And then I was off and on my own. And I knew I couldn't do this on my own. So I reached out to the St. Augustine Archaeological Association. I believe I sent an email to somebody early on just saying, you know, like, I've got this project, I'm looking for some help, and they forwarded it to a listserv, I believe. And I got a lot of bites. There were a lot of people that reached out that were interested. And I got to meet a lot of people from that organization that came and worked with me for a couple of hours, and then others who spent days with me. You know, some of the people in this photo are the ones that I probably spent the most time with. There was Tony Wallace, Nick McAuliffe was a huge help. Janet Jordan, of course. Gail Burnick was another one, and Buff Gordon was my first volunteer, which was really exciting to me because I'm a huge fan of her work. I think Gail actually took these photos. But you can see his work here. You know, we literally measured the cemetery. You know, we had these baselines, tape measures that were never ending, and just worked off of them to record the measurements. I did it with that notebook, going around collecting all of the measurements, and then sat down. This was me a lot of the time. We'd get a bunch of measurements, and I'd go sit by myself and plot it on a map. And I brought those. The map right there on the table is the map that I produced. Anyone wants to take a look at that? You can see I had to weigh it down with a bunch of crap because it's been rolled up for 15 years. But, you know, the next step that I took on was trying to do an inventory of the markers. While there'd been inventories of this cemetery before, there were several, there'd never been one quite as detailed as I wanted to do. There was the Coombs map, which is on the left here, and that was done in the 70s. And it's really detailed, and it was a huge help. And actually, it was really good for research when I was comparing this to mine after I completed the mapping, because you can see some changes since the 70s. These are marked here. They all correspond between the two maps by the color. You know, I was able to figure out that this tablet was a footstone that was eventually, it must have fallen and it was moved inside this plot by the oak tree. Up here, this tomb with this name is actually down here now. So at some point that had been relocated. And in the Coombs map, let's see, this tablet right here, when I did the inventory, it was leaning against this box. It's now standing next to this box. So at some point it must have fallen and was leaned up against that box, just propped up. There's so much you learn from these comparisons, which is one of the reasons it's so great to like do these and update them, and so the comparison is so valuable. Other things that I found were this marker was one of the only ones that had an inscription that I could not read. I could not figure out what this said at all, and tried so hard, but we got nothing off of it. And we had a name. It was readable in the 70s. So because of that, we know that this was Christiana B. O'Sullivan. So one of the things, you know, usually when people are doing inventories, they're going out and they're trying to capture the epitaphs, they're trying to get those inscriptions. I really wanted to capture the markers themselves. I was interested in the forms as funerary art, I was interested in the materials, and trying to do condition assessments on what I was seeing. For this, I developed my own survey form. This was basically, I collected as many survey forms as I could find. And I started picking them apart, figuring out things that were helpful and things that, you know, I could drop and what I could use to develop my own and tailor it to this project. That's what we have on the left there. I actually brought those too. That's that stack over there on the table. I definitely encourage people to come take a look if you want to. For this, I really wanted to work with students. This is a great project to work with students, having people come in and volunteer on documenting markers like this. And I reached out to Heather Hall, who led the anthropology program at Santa Fe Community College, now Santa Fe College. So I was a student at that college. I was an anthropology major. That's where it all began. And I studied under like Stuart McCrae, who started that program, was a mentor of mine. And he'd retired by then, but I really wanted to do something with that program. I really wanted to try and connect with students from there, because it's such a great group, it's such a great program. And so I reached out to Heather, and she brought out students from Gainesville to work with me. And these are a few of the people that I spent a fair amount of time with. In the pictures, you've got Jennifer Durden, Rachel Hunt, Sarah Hatfield. This was a lot of fun. I really, really enjoyed this experience. You know, I worked with each student on a few markers, just sort of like a tutorial, walking them through it, and then I sent them on their way. And they would go and record a monument, come back, show me the form, I'd mark it off, and you know, you can see there's like flags for ones that we had recorded. It was a great experience, and often we would like no single one of us could read an entire stone sometimes. And so we would huddle over and look at it. You would see 2 or 3 people surrounding a stone trying to figure out what we're seeing. It was a great experience. If you've never gone and tried to transcribe markers, I definitely encourage it. It's a fun project. So beyond getting the epitaphs, I really wanted to record the inscriptions as close to how they appeared on the stones. I'll show you what that looks like. I see them a lot in inventories where they go in and they record what they're seeing, they just write it down, and they try to do it word for word. You should always do that, like write the lettering the way it appears. But what I wanted to do was make it look as close to how it appeared on the stone as I could. Because a lot of people rely on photos to do that, but that's really, like, you've got to have a really pristine marker for that to work, because often those inscriptions, especially if they started to erode, aren't going to come through in photos very clearly. So I challenged my volunteers to try and really get in there and copy them as they were seeing them. Now, reading inscriptions is both an art and a science. There's definitely a technique to it, but it's a challenge of troubleshooting and figuring things out as you go. And this cemetery had some tough ones. I actually learned at the cemetery that a summer shower is the best way. It's the best precursor for reading markers. Like I learned about using spray bottles, going out with mirrors, flashlights, and trying to get the light just right so that you could get those inscriptions. Nothing worked better than a summer shower and then walking through the cemetery. Like I could see them pretty clearly. They would really pop. So I mentioned how I challenged my volunteers to take really detailed, sketches of the inscriptions. Well, it turns out a couple of them were artists. And, I think it was Jennifer, the student who was in the chapel next to the Varela ledger in an earlier slide. She was incredibly talented, and I've got a few of these that they had worked on that were so good, pulled out for people to see. This is one of my favorites. There's another one down here that I encourage people to come look at, where I couldn't read it at all. We couldn't read the marker. It was so far gone, and the inscription was so fine. Like the lines were so fine that we couldn't figure it out because it was a fancy script. And each letter had like multiple lines in it. And so we actually went through and line for line just copied the lines as we saw them, having no idea that they formed letters. And once we saw it on the paper, we started to see what it meant, which is really cool. So I spent so much time in the cemetery that summer. And I was rarely alone. In addition to all of those people that were helping me, I met a lot of people along Cordova Street. There were often groups of people standing outside the fence trying to take pictures. One of my favorite things to do during breaks was to wander up to the fence and just talk to people. I would tell them what I was doing, because people would stare at me, some of them would yell out at me, and I'd tell them what I was doing. I would share some history of the cemetery. Every now and then, I would take someone's camera in and get them some good photos. I met some real characters, but most of the people that I met were just like me a year earlier. They were taken in by the cemetery and wanting to know more. I was even approached by tour guides, interested in learning more about the history of the cemetery, which I thought was really great. But I do have to share, I did have less pleasant run-ins with some residents. I wanted to tell this one. Have y'all encountered roosters in the cemetery? Is that still a thing?
Well, I think they're all gone now. The ospreys caught them.
Good.
The neighbors who had them are still there.
Yeah, so while I was out there, there were these two hens, it's the same ones every time, and this rooster that would often like come in. I'd get there pretty early in the morning. They would come in, hop the fence, and just graze in the cemetery. And this would start when like all the people, right before they came into town. So this was their safe space to graze. And they'd be in there for hours, and then later in the day, they'd jump the fence and move on. But this rooster was convinced I was after his ladies. And so I would be in there. At this point in the project, this was later in the summer, I was mostly just taking photos. And so I was in there trying to capture good photos of every marker. And if anyone's ever photographed cemeteries, like really gone in to do like a photo inventory of a cemetery, you know that like you get into some weird positions to take photos. There's like a cemetery photo yoga that you do. You get in these odd positions all stretched out to try and get just the right angle. And so picture this, like I'm in some weird position. I'm stretched out, my legs are like all spread out, and I'm like getting just the right angle. And then this little monster would charge me out of nowhere. It would happen all the time. I remember one time I was on the phone with Allison, my wife, and it happened. And I asked her, because she is a little more knowledgeable about animals. I was like, honey, will I win a fight with this rooster? Because I think it might happen, and I need to know. And she said, no, you will not. Do not fight the rooster. And I'm glad it never happened because, I mean, look at it. It's magnificent. I definitely would have lost that fight. But I'm glad that remains a mystery, though. So research was challenging. You know, the early history was hard to get at because I don't read Spanish. And you know, so I was kind of limited to secondary sources. But fortunately, there are a lot of really good secondary sources. And you know, I really tried to track every account of this place, you know, this piece of land, going all the way back to the first Spanish period. And accounts were limited, but there were a lot of good, really detailed maps that show these early periods. Like going all the way through the 19th century, all the way up to Sanborn's, you know, you've got a lot of good maps to use, comparisons to see how these places evolve. I also had great imagery. So there is a lot of really good 19th century photography of St. Augustine and Tolomato. And a lot of these photographs are such high resolution. There is so much data from them. I spent so much time just zooming in on every spot in these photos, trying to figure out what I was looking at. What was there that isn't there now? Or what was there that looks different now? I've got a few I can show you here. This one was great. So this is my photo. And here you can see this is Father O'Reilly's tomb, how it originally looked. This thing, I've got another photo in a moment I'll show you that's fascinating. But one of the things I love about these photos is just look at Tolomato. You know, like it's a totally different world. You've got like these dense graves, these wooden crosses, these wooden plot fences. Like it's remarkable. Like you get why people would have been fascinated by it. So this is another, shows you the changes to O'Reilly's tomb. This, I think it's right here. You can see that interesting marker I pointed out a moment ago. But yeah, I learned a lot from those. And also changes to the chapel. You know, at the end of the 19th century, you get a good view here of what it looked like. By the 1950s, you can see after Varela had been moved, how they renovated the chapel as more of a tribute to Varro, who remained. And then later, you can see it in the 90s, after Varro was moved, and they restored it as a tribute to Varela. So I spent a lot of time in the research libraries of the St. Augustine Historical Society and at the Castillo. But the Historical Society was a huge resource. Actually, the subject files on Tolomato were incredibly valuable. There's a ton of information in there, a lot of great leads to follow. Charles was a huge resource, Charles Tinsley, and definitely helped me a lot. Was very generous in helping me. But I also conducted a lot of interviews with people who were connected to the cemetery. John actually helped make some introductions. So this was actually from an interview I did with Bruce Wright, who was one of the groundskeepers at San Lorenzo, and he had done a lot of work at Tolomato. And so he literally gave me a tour one day of work that either he had done or work that he had seen done personally. I walked through the cemetery with him that afternoon and had a copy of my map and just jotted notes everywhere he told me things. You know, that kind of information often exists only in the memories of the people that were there. So being able to get those stories down on paper was incredibly valuable. And here you can see some of the things he talked about, corroborated by photos I found. He talked about how someone had rebuilt part of the wall around this plot. You can see prior to that work in 1950. This tomb has always fascinated me. You wouldn't recognize it because this is it today. They completely rebuilt it at some point. But you can see over time, like there's multiple photos of this thing slowly deteriorating. And when you look at the Coombs map, by 1976, it's marked by hashed lines, which means that it had collapsed. So it must have been completely collapsed or rebuilt during the renovations in the 70s and 80s. So I also spoke with Carol Lopez Bradshaw. She had a lot of great stories and memories of things going on in the cemetery over the years. That was super helpful. I met with the children of X.L. Pellissier, who was, like a known leader in advocating for the cemetery. I met with Ted Pellissier, Patricia Danahy. Patricia actually set me up at her dining room table with boxes of files that were her father's to go through. So through comparisons, firsthand accounts, studying the landscape of the cemetery itself and the markers, I was able to sort of map changes in the landscape over time. I wanted to know the history, I wanted to know how it evolved, and I think I got the broad strokes. But there's a lot of things I didn't really get to do. The study of the parish burial records at the Historical Society's Research Library. I know that those are online now. There's a ton of information there that I wasn't able to really get into as much as I would like. I think that would be a valuable way to put names to all of the graves in that cemetery. That'd be a great project. There are additional city, county, state, municipal records, the records of the diocese that could be incredibly valuable in understanding further changes and things that have happened in the cemetery. I'm talking about things like marker replacements, renovations, the widening of Cordova. There's got to be additional records of those activities that could further contextualize, things that we don't know or know a little bit about. Another thing that always fascinated me. This came from a conversation with another historian. The correlation between the real estate boom during Flagler's era and the closure of these old cemeteries in the city. Someone suggested to me that, Flagler, or at least that movement, must have been instrumental in that. And it could have been timing. There's a lot of ways to look at that, but I think that that'd be an interesting thread to chase, So I investigated newspaper records while I was there. I was looking for any mention I could find of Tolomato. And I did find some good information, but I think that there's a lot more to be done there. Because I think that's going to be a more intensive project than I had time to do. But I feel like there's a lot of information, particularly of the 20th century, that could be gotten from that. And you never know, like any mention could be valuable. It might be in passing, but it might talk about a name or, a particular activity that was going on or an event, and that could be another lead to chase down. It'd be incredibly valuable. Another thing it could do is reveal the names of advocates from past generations that also tried to make the cemetery a cause. I'd like to hear those stories, know their names. And who knows what we might learn. We might get some more details about things that were going on in the cemetery, or find some more photos. You know, I always want more photos, so that would be great. But point is, there are stones waiting to be turned over, and new treasures to be found. I really only scratched the surface of my project. So, I learned so much over the course of this project. You know, I learned a lot about the cemetery, about cemeteries in general, about St. Augustine, about preservation, unfortunately, roosters. One lesson in particular sticks with me all these years later. I mentioned that I didn't really come to this project with a personal connection to Tolomato, but I certainly left with one. And that connection took time, as it should. You know, all that time that I spent in the cemetery, either wandering the grounds, becoming familiar with all the different pieces and features and markers, talking to people, you know, making memories, finding the particular aspects of the cemetery that I found most interesting, you know, and special. You know, I've seen the sunrise and sunset on Tolomato many, many times. And 15 years later, it may sound cheesy, but I can still close my eyes and hear what it sounds like when the wind's blowing through those trees. You know, I'm lucky. I've been to some remarkable places over the course of my life and career, but I haven't found another Tolomato cemetery, at least not for me. You know, when I started this project, I already knew this place was important. I think it ranks easily with any other place in the city. But something I learned in the years since and in the course of this project is that it's not enough for a place to be important or even sacred. As much as I'd like to believe that, that's not what I learned from my time here or my years in the field. You know, you have to create opportunities for people to make their own connections with the place, to form their own memories there. It's about creating opportunities for it to become meaningful for them on their own terms. That is what makes preservation sustainable. Now, as I saw it, the biggest hurdles to Tolomato were access and presentation. So few had the opportunity to know the place as we know it now. You know, most of the people that I encountered, you know, were really interested in Tolomato, but that interest didn't get them any closer than Cordova. So in my thesis, I talked about opening the metaphorical gates. For a truly surreal moment, I'm going to quote myself. Past Matthew said, "Perpetual care for any heritage or resource, be it natural or cultural, is only possible if enough people value the resource as an important and enriching contributing factor in their lives. Such valuation is entirely contingent on the ability for a wide range of individuals to develop a relationship with the site." Now, I'm sorry, it's painfully obvious to me that a grad student wrote that. But what I'm trying to say there is that places survive when enough people love them. And as stewards, we have to create opportunities for that to happen. There's this great quote from Lynette Strongstead that's always been in my mind when I think about cemeteries, that it's about how children who have favorite stones in the cemetery will grow up to be teens who, you know, would never want to harm them or tolerate others that would. You know, I'm a romantic, but I believe if enough people have the chance to experience a place like this, to form their own reasons for why it's important to them, it'll last a little longer. And that's often the best that we can hope for as preservationists, is to buy a place like this a little more time, you know, to win over another generation, and then hopefully another and another. But after I graduated, I sent a copy of my thesis to John, who I believe immediately handed it to Elizabeth. You poor, poor, wonderful person. And Elizabeth went on to form the TCPA. I was involved like very briefly early on, but distance made that hard. I think my biggest contribution to the TCPA was probably the name, which I'm sorry is very long. This group has far exceeded my hopes. I really want you to know that. Like many, I've watched this organization from afar. I followed you on social media. I've seen photos of your open houses, your open days, your tours, your events. I want to go to the next one of these. This is incredible. I've seen the work that you've done, and it's incredible. And more importantly, you've made access possible. 35,000 people. That's amazing. Go back to 2008, before that, what would it have been? It's incredible to me. And something that I wanted to say was that every time you've opened the cemetery, you've created opportunities for future stewards. For this cemetery and for others. And that's an even bigger takeaway. You're doing great work for this cemetery and for others. And you make it an event. Like, that's the part that amazes me. I loved seeing your slides and your photos of what you've been doing. And I've loved watching you, on Facebook and other places, tracking the things that you're doing, because, you don't just open it up and have a little tour and let people wander. You have a harp playing. You have people in period clothes. You have people who can talk about genealogy. You've got so many different things that people can do, as well as you have these wonderful guided tours. And every time you do this, you create memorable events, you help people make memories, and then every time you also make a fuss like this, every time you make these special events, you're showing people that this place is important. And that's incredible. You are very much a living, breathing, and very compelling billboard for this cause. And that's amazing. I really appreciate you. Once in a while, Elizabeth will send me an update. She's been doing this in the last 15 years. Every now and then, she'll reach out to me, and every time you do, you make my day. And in part because you're delightful, but also because you bring me back here. Elizabeth often talks me up. She's been doing it all day and all weekend. And makes me feel like I started something here, but I honestly think I was just lucky to be at the right place, at the right time, with the right people, with thesis anxiety. And, and I got to be a part of something really special. But I want to be clear today. This organization, your incredible efforts at the cemetery, I played a very small part in it. And I really couldn't be prouder of that. But I want to say, I'm grateful for everybody listening to my story, but the real story begins where mine ends. I think what you've done here is a success story. And it's just waiting to be a case study in a book. And I'd love to hear that story. But I want to thank everybody who made this possible, who brought me back today. This is absolutely a homecoming for me, and I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you.
Well, that was truly wonderful. It really was. I mean, it sort of put it all together. I mean, really just. Because you got the different levels of what we're trying to do, all the things that you've thought of, the different layers of explanation, different layers of interpretation, and the different also the aspects. I mean, I think that was wonderful. I'm just so thrilled. And really, it was reading the book, and John did give it to me, and there's several of us here. And Nick McCall, who is not here, unfortunately, right now, who's at the archaeological association.
Is Nick at Chatterfest?
Nick, yeah, right, exactly. And Janet Jordan, and Louise Kennedy, and we all sat in my living room. I was living on Main Street at that time. We all sat there and, went over this, and then we went to see Father Tom for permission, since, the cathedral owns the cemetery. And he was, he was enthusiastic. I think he was a little concerned at first, a little wary, but he came around, and he's been very supportive since then, as you saw in the fundraising photograph there. So it really was the work of just people who this message appealed, and that was why we consider him sort of our intellectual founder. So thank you very, very much, Matthew. And the other thing is there's food out there. Do not go, because we got a lot of food. We got a lot of acceptances on our e-bike, but of course we couldn't park when they got here, so I have a feeling a lot of people just drove around the block a few times and thought, what am I going to do? We didn't expect that. So there's plenty of stuff out there. We don't want to have to clean up. So, eat and drink. There's also wine and other things. Okay? Any questions for?
I had a question. Where's the detail of the angel from?
I use it in presentations a lot.
Oh.
I took it from a marker, and I've used it in a lot of presentations that have cemetery topics.
Any other questions? Well, I guess it must be time to go out there and hit the steps.